So we're going to start off today with two student presenters. Both of them are ready. Yeah, we're good? All right, sweet. So let's start it off. Celia, come on up. Give her a warm welcome, please.
Okay. Hi, I'm Celia. I'm a freshman. And this poem is called Suffocating, and I kind of wrote it when I was going through some hard times in school and a little bit during the pandemic, so. Humanity can be poisonous. I feel helpless and alone in a place of trash where young minds who do not understand the elderly, yet. I know that their decisions are fallacious. They do not see nor comprehend the creation that arose an ocean away. So we continue to fight ourselves when trusting is a cut above. I won't be able to feel the crisp breeze against my face as long as appalling students continue to corrupt what can easily make society progress. Understand that we, from ages 9 to 25, must rise to the occasion instead of making TikToks trying to see who gets more followers. We are afraid of trusting each other. I said it. Hold one breath with me as I show you why. If I have you hold your breath, can you hold it for as long as I say? Stopping the flow of your blood stops the flow of your body. Yet, we don't hesitate to do what we are told, as long as we trust them. Trust is not taken lightly. We pour our souls into one person, and they can let us down so easily, yet we continue to push and root for them, as if they are advancing. Knowing that you are holding your breath inches away from death can be traumatizing, yet you continue to hold yours like mine. Don't breathe. Not until I have told you to do so, for it is I who now controls your fate, whether you will make it to tomorrow. Whether you are at the next election, when you walk down the aisle, or even when you are meeting a friend for the first time, will you wonder if you are able to trust them, to put your whole head and heart into their hands and understand that they are looking out for you? Do they want what is best for you? Ages 9 to 25, understand that it will soon be you who your parents raised, only to see you die in my grasp. What I control. For control is what everyone seeks, yet so few are able to find it. Breathe. Thank you.
Awesome job, Celia. Thank you so much. All right, we got one more. Another freshman. Bringing it, freshman. I love it. Molly, come on up.
Hi, my name is Molly Shinnick, and this is not something I'm used to doing with poetry, but I tried. So here we go. The title of my poem is Mercy, and it's an overlook of my own personal experiences with Jesus. Here we go. There is no price tag on the gift you gave. For a friend, there is no charge. What I gave back didn't have to match. You know I never could. Everything died for nothing, so I've been set free indeed. Your gift is priceless and free to all, but few understand the worth. Ridiculed, made a fairy tale, by those who disbelieve, yet you did not turn back. You persevered with this love that never can be matched. The hardest task to ever be, you did for our well-being. You died so that I wouldn't, as the holes in your hands were bleeding. We've all tried to find our happiness in things other than you, but I know I've had my life saved in many ways. You are, I am, alive. Thank you, guys.
There you go. That is part of what Writers Expo is all about, right? Molly said, I don't usually do this, but I thought I'd get, that's exactly it, right? So one thing to consider next year, if we get this going again, have you written anything? You got anything you might want to just share through writing, personal stuff? I know it can be hard getting up here, being vulnerable. Even as teachers, we get up here and we're shaky. So Well done, well done. Can we give him just another round of applause? All right, possibly to help you perhaps share something next year, we have a presenter today who could be of aid in that regard. Let me introduce her. She is an award-winning journalist and author who has written for USA Today, the Orlando Sentinel, the Chicago Tribune, and ESPN. Early in her career, she covered the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Florida State Seminoles. Later, here in Chicago, she covered the 90s-era Bulls, the World Series-winning White Sox, 3 Cubs playoff teams, 2 Blackhawks championship teams, and even the Bears team that went to the Super Bowl a little while ago. She's also covered the Olympic Games, the Final Four, college football bowl games, major tennis tournaments, and at least 1 major golf tournament. She has written a biography of former Cubs manager Lou Piniella, a book on life with the early 90s Chicago Bulls. In fact, you may have seen her if you watched the documentary The Last Dance. Was it like 2 summers ago, last summer, something like that? You may have seen and heard from her there. She also has written a memoir. Some of you are familiar with this, State, okay, about her championship-winning basketball team in 1979, senior at Niles West. And currently she teaches as a faculty member at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. She, folks, is a journalism rock star. Please welcome Melissa Isaacson.
Thank you so much, and I would absolutely echo the part about being really brave to be out here, and the 2 poems were amazing. It is scary, very much so, even for professional journalists to talk in front of groups or to walk up to strangers. I'm forever telling my students how scary that is, even for seasoned journalists, and anyway, I just want to throw that out there. But so you may have been staring at this and wondering, everyone has a story, what I was talking about. But everyone does, and more importantly, everyone in here has the ability to tell that story. You need just one thing to be a great writer. Anybody care to venture a guess what that one thing is? Just yell it out. Close. Imagination, creativity, all right, but not. Yes, were you at the last session? Okay, that was really smart then. I'm very impressed. Curiosity. So you might be sitting out there and saying, as many of my students who are journalism majors, which is always surprising to me, but not anymore, it shouldn't be, and they'll say, I'm really not a good writer. They'll be sitting in journalism in one of the best journalism schools in the country and say, I really don't like talking to people, I'm not really a good writer. But if you ask the very best writers in journalism, almost to a person, they'll say, I'm a better reporter. But it all starts with curiosity. All it takes is curiosity. All it takes is your eyes, your ears, the ability to listen. More than talk to people, the ability to listen, which is a really, really tough thing nowadays. We're not good listeners. I don't even think it's nowadays. I think it's in general. Human beings only hear like a small fraction of really what's out there. I'll challenge my students, like, okay, for the next half hour, really listen. It's hard. It's hard not to let your mind wander. But you can do it. Everyone can do that. You might be saying, I can't really write well, but you can definitely listen. And I'm going to tell you how that's going to make you a good writer. But I'm going to talk mostly about writing through the prism of journalism because that's what I've done my whole life, or my whole professional life, and that's what I'm teaching now. But also because essentially the whole world goes through journalism. Anything you could think of is going through the world of journalism. There are great stories all around you. They're in the hallways, in your classrooms, in your homes. When I taught at DePaul, before I taught at Northwestern, I did this exercise that I like to do with kids the first day. I pair everybody off and I say, okay, interview each other. Come up with, if you were writing a profile on each other. And there was an odd number of students that day, so I had to be with a student. And I walked around a little bit first to listen before I talked to my student, my partner, And, there are usual questions, where do you live and how many siblings do you have and, what do your parents do for a living and this, that, and the other thing. And you could tell everybody seemed sort of bored. No one was really sharing that much. And I sat down with the girl who was the woman who was my partner. And her name was Annalise. And so the first question I had was born out of curiosity. I said, wow, Annalise, that's a really cool name. That's so pretty. Any special meaning behind it or reason why you were named Annalise? And she kind of pauses for a second and looks at me and she goes, well, my grandparents are both Holocaust survivors. And so my parents named me after Anne Frank. Her real name was Annalise. And my gosh, as a journalist, we often will say like, oh, in a moment like that, it's like, thank you, Lord, for giving me this great story. It sounds really scummy to say it that way, because of course it's a terrible, sad story. Although her grandparents survived, so it's one of triumph as well. But it was a nugget, it was gold from the heavens above, that all it took was me just going, that's an interesting name. Why do you have that? Maybe it wouldn't have come out, a story like that. But when I covered the Bulls, and I'll get to that a little bit, but I was the first woman in Chicago to ever be the principal beat writer of the Chicago Bulls. From the Tribune to the Sun-Times, I covered the Bears. I was the first Bears beat writer from the Tribune. And it gave me certain advantages. It gave me many, perceived disadvantages if I wanted them to. Walking through a locker room in the NFL is scary for anyone, particularly a woman. And so there was a lot of things that I had to get over, but what was so great was that I had a different curiosity. I had different questions that I would just naturally ask. How many of you heard of Brian Urlacher? You probably know him from the hair ads, but when I covered the team, he was their star linebacker. He'll be in the Hall of Fame. One day I went up to him and I saw a picture of his daughter, baby picture in back of him taped up to his locker. And right away I'm like, I bet you're potty training. I could tell by the age of the baby that was probably the stage that she was in. How did I know that? Because I was a mother myself. That wouldn't have been a question that any of the men would have asked. And suddenly, he had hair then, he let his hair down. And I saw a side to him and heard a side to him that I never would have if I wouldn't have just been curious and brought a different kind of curiosity to that interview. You guys are living through a time right now as teenagers that is unprecedented. I shouldn't have to tell you that, you know that, you've been living it. But trust me when I tell you how unbelievably special it is. People will be wanting to interview you 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now, asking you how you saw this pandemic through the eyes of a teenager. How did you process it? What were you thinking? How did you survive this? And you're living it right now. You could be writing books right now. You could be writing the first chapter. And you could be, in one day, let me tell you, some of you will write books about this because you have been in this place. And you'll be able to conjure up the memories. But what I hope you'll do is you won't rely on your memories. Because in 10 years from now, you'll get together at your reunion or whatever. And you'll be able to remember certain things. You'll tell stories and you'll laugh about certain things. But you won't really be able to get inside your teenage brain. Trust me, because I tried, and it's very difficult. It will be gold if you write this down. If you just jot down a few thoughts. If you start, you could write a book. There's absolutely no reason you can't. Start with the first page. Think about what it would be. Someone will pay you a lot of money for that, I'm telling you. But the thing that's cool about journalism is you could write about all kinds of stuff. You could write about science, religion, health, mental health, cops, courts, celebrity news, right? How would you like to have been a celebrity reporter the last couple weeks? Sorry, I'm sort of dependent on making sure I'm online here with this. You could write about business. Our grandparents used to save front pages religiously. If you went to anybody's house 40, 50 years ago, they would probably have somewhere in their basement or somewhere in some closet like my parents did, a stack of newspapers with front pages. Maybe your grandparents, or not yours, but mine, would have Dewey Beats Truman from the Tribune. My parents, when they passed away, I was looking through their stuff, and they had President Kennedy being assassinated. They had the moon launch, front pages. Throughout history, journalists have been the first witnesses, right? They've been the chroniclers. They've risked their lives to tell stories in disasters. We have disaster beat reporters. People, that's all they do is tell stories about disasters and wars. They take photos of the bombed hospitals and schools in the Ukraine. You don't have to wonder if that's real. You don't have to listen to people who say that it's not, because you have real-life photographs from photographers from the New York Times and the Washington Post taking those photos. Journalists are heroes. I believe that very, very firmly, more than ever now. You can write about social justice, and you could write about social justice in sports. That's a beat. There are beats at newspapers because social justice is going through sports so definitively that that's all they write. There's a columnist with the New York Times, Kurt Streeter, that's almost all he writes are social justice stories. The person who wrote this story was a guest in my class on Thursday via Zoom. His name's Neil Greenberg. He's the Washington Post advanced analytics writer. How cool is that if you like advanced analytics? That's all he does is write stories for the Post on advanced analytics stuff. You can write provocative stories for provocative magazines. You could write provocative headlines. You can cover fashion. You can do what we call service stories. During the pandemic, these were huge, right? Everybody was home, and how to bake stories were huge. There was always stories about how to do a lot of things. How-to stories are always big. Reporters give us vital, everyday information that we can use. Someone's got to write these stories. Stories that will improve our physical, and our mental health. When you're a sports writer, like me, you may find yourself, which I have often done over the years, being sort of self-deprecating. Well, I'm not saving any lives. And then you realize that you have that power as well. When a story comes to your attention, like this one came to mind about a Chicago boxer named Paco Rodriguez, who died in the ring from a punch to the head, and whose decision with his wife only weeks before that he become an organ donor would save the lives of 5 women who received his heart, his lungs, his liver, his kidney, his pancreas. The woman who received Paco Rodriguez's heart had actually gone to the arena where he died and was a boxing fan. It was an amazing story to write. I wrote the story, and at the bottom we had a little label that said, if you want to become an organ donor, call this number, urge people to become organ donors. If one person did that, if one life was saved, I'm not saying I saved a life, but I certainly had an impact. I had that power through a story. We have a lot of great abilities to write really powerful stories. Obits are really great stories. And when I say obits, you probably picture or imagine death notices, right? And that's not what it is, saying when the funeral is. Obits are really beautiful profiles. If you get a chance to read obits in the New York Times in particular, have a very great reputation. I've written a ton of obits in my career. Those are some of the best journalism. This isn't an obit, of course. It's a profile. You could write about famous people. It's really going fast. Paige Beckers. How many of you know who Paige Beckers is? Raise your hand. I'll be sad if you don't, if there's nobody who knows Paige Beckers. Really? She's one of the best college women's basketball players in the country from UConn. She just played in the tournament. You guys know who Lewis Hamilton is? Anybody? An auto racer? You know this guy, I bet. Yeah, all right. So there's all kinds of stories you can write about all kinds of different people. And you can write about yourself as well. And boy, if I ever want to age myself, I don't know what it was about cameras in the 60s, but like, also as the youngest of 4 kids, I have to say, so my parents apparently had no ability to take photos after the 3rd kid, because this is all I got, or I got very few. It makes me look like I was raised in the 1920s, not the 60s. But it all comes back to our curiosity, our dreams. I had 2 older brothers, I loved sports. I had no idea what that meant, loving sports. All it meant to me was chasing after them. If you saw a little girl at a park in the 1960s or the early 70s, chances are they were going to get their brothers to come home for dinner. They were not playing in a Little League game. They were not playing in an organized sport. This was the first uniform I ever had, and it had a picture of a girl with a curly bob and a script fancy schmancy L for Lincolnwood, and it sort of bothered me, but I was very happy to have a uniform, believe me. The next year I watched, and I could tell you what I wore, I could tell you where I was standing in the room when Billie Jean King beat Bobby Riggs in a tennis match called the Battle of the Battle of the Sexes. It was 1 year after Title IX passed. How many of you know, raise your hand if you have any idea what Title IX is? Any idea at all? Okay, kind of some half-hearted, and then a few. So probably when you hear Title IX, once you're in college, you might hear this more, the Office of Sexual Harassment, right? The Office of Sexual Misconduct, the Office of Title IX. That's what my students know when you ask them what Title IX is. Well, this year's the 50th anniversary of Title IX. And what it was a law in 1972 that gave girls, really simple and sounds ridiculous, I know I look old, but I'm not really that old, gave girls the opportunity that any boy has in any school activities. Any public schools that are funded by the government, they got equal rights. When I was in high school, when I was in junior high, before that we didn't have that. So the Watergate scandal got me interested in journalism. Again, that curiosity. I'm jumping around a bit. Excuse me, it's not the most fluid PowerPoint. I'm not a good PowerPoint person. When I entered high school, but it'll all make sense. I'm tying it all up. When I entered high school as a freshman in the fall of 1975, again, we look like the olden times, girls, get this, just try to imagine this if you will. Again, not that old. I have kids a little older than you guys. Girls in Niles West High School in a fairly successful suburb, if you will, middle-class suburb, in the shadow of a major metropolis of Chicago, did not allow girls to practice or play in the main gym of our high school. We called it the boys' gym. That's what we called it. And we weren't allowed to play in it. But guess what? 4 years later, we won the 3rd ever Illinois State Girls Basketball Championship and played to standing room only crowds in that same gym where we once were not allowed. If you see, the upper balcony was full there. That's why I have the word transformation in my book title, because it clearly was an unbelievable transformation. And it planted the seeds for this, for our state basketball championship, and it planted the seeds for this, which I'll get back to. But it also gave me the courage to be a sports writer. I don't know that I ever would have, I'm not saying I wouldn't have been successful on some front, maybe I would have found journalism. I don't think I would be walking through locker rooms, I don't think that I would probably have the courage to cover the NFL. This took me around the world to cover things like the British Open and 20 Wimbledons, and pictured here in 2017 covering the Olympic Games in Rio. It was my 4th Olympic Games. This was the Winter Olympics in Italy. It led me to this parking lot and this really weird picture that I have on my, in front of my office door because it's so funny. Anybody know who this guy is? Dikembe Mutombo, I heard that. Good one, very nicely done. Touch them all, as we say. This was a parking lot in Austria in 2017 in the World Special Olympics Games, an event I never thought I would cover, but produced some of the greatest stories I've ever written, and led me to Dikembe Mutombo, who is a really tremendous donor and philanthropist and did a lot for Special Olympics. In my day, maybe nowadays sports writers might take pictures with athletes or take selfies. We would never, ever do such a thing. We would never, you don't want to give up your veil of objectivity, so we would never even ask, we would never ask for an autograph. You don't clap in press boxes, right? You're objective. But after I talked to Dikembe, he goes, "You want to take a picture?" And I said, "Well, no, it's okay." And he's like, "Come on, you know you want to take a picture." I'm like, "Okay." And I'm really glad I did, because it's crazy. I think he was 7'2", I want to say. Journalism took me to Super Bowls, and it took me to cover this guy in the prime of his career, which I'll also get back to, but was a blessing unlike anything I probably had in journalism, for sure, to just watch him in his prime. I covered him when he retired, Michael Jordan. I covered him when he came back. I covered him when he changed his number to number 45 from 23. I got that scoop. That was a big scoop. If you don't think it was, just imagine number 23, and then he wore 45 for a couple weeks. So if you could find a 45 jersey, grab it. It's going to be worth a lot of money. You may be able to put your kids through college one day with that. I covered him when he led the Bulls to still more titles when he came back. And I covered him when he left again. Sports writing took me to World Series. This is the White Sox in 2005, Stanley Cup Finals. This was their first one in 2010, the Blackhawks. And eventually it led me back to high school, where I realized that maybe the best story was one that I had never written, but one that was there all along, just kind of waiting to be unearthed. A story that I never knew when I was 17, because there's a lot of things you don't know when you're 17, and especially in the 70s you didn't know. You didn't know what was going on across the street. Your mother would say, "Oh, so-and-so is getting divorced." She'd whisper, because you weren't supposed to know that. It wasn't on social media. You never knew, like I didn't know, that our principal had 2 daughters who were very athletic, but we would never call them athletes back then. We would certainly never call a girl a jock. But he wanted very much for his daughters to play soccer. He wanted very much for the girls in his high school to play varsity sports. So he would, I found out 25 years later as a professional reporter, he'd go downstate. He was a member of the IHSA. You guys have heard of the IHSA, right? The Illinois High School Association. It runs sports in the state and other things, activities. And he would come back frustrated, and he would tell his teachers, wouldn't tell us, of course, "These crew cuts are not listening. They think that basketball's too rough for girls. They don't want to give up gym time for girls." But he kept fighting and kept fighting. We didn't know that our coach at the time, Arlene Mulder, who was the only woman who wanted the job. Nobody wanted that job. I think she got paid $200 for coaching us. She was a tomboy as a kid, because that's what you were if you were a girl and you played sports. You were a tomboy on her farm as a child, but she definitely didn't know how to coach. So she was unselfish enough, I found out later, to go to the boys' coach at the school, who was this very legendary, successful boys' coach. And he happened to also be a feminist. No one knew that. He didn't even know it. He wouldn't have called himself a feminist in a million years, but he was the only man on the physical education staff who helped her. And they would huddle in the corner of the teacher's lounge and scribble on napkins, and he would coach her to coach us. And in return, she would teach him, in later years he told us, about motivation, about things that I would learn from Phil Jackson coaching the Bulls years later, about positive self-imagery. She gave us books. She had us leaning up against walls for isometric strength and things that nobody was doing at the time. She knew how to delegate, and she knew how to build consensus, and she knew how to motivate the last person on the bench, because she didn't allow us to know how many points and rebounds we had. She was so smart that she knew that if the last person on the bench didn't feel invested in the team, we weren't going to go anywhere. We were this little suburban, short little team. She built us into champions, but then she left. She went on maternity leave, and the driver's ed teacher coached us. He didn't want any part of it. He didn't want to coach girls. And he ended up coming around, and we ended up winning the state championship. And guess what happened to our coach that I knew 25 years later? She became the first ever mayor of Arlington Heights. And when she retired from Arlington Heights as the mayor, after 25 years and 5 terms, she was one of the best-known local politicians in the country. She had abilities when she was a young woman coaching us that she never even knew she had. All those things were because of Title IX and because of what she learned and what I discovered later. So the book it took a long time to get published, believe me. It took 15 years. And it's not because it took me 15 years to write it. I wrote it pretty quickly, but it began as a basketball story. And it eventually became a people story. And it sort of began with the story of my parents, which this is the cover of the Chicago Tribune magazine in 2008 about my parents' battle with Alzheimer's that began when I was in high school. And it wound back to the realization that my story was really part of our story, and that somehow I had to write it, and so I did. And yeah, it was about basketball, but it was about so much more. It was also about a group of girls in those first years, that first blush after Title IX was passed, where girls in this country were not given access to the big gym, and were not given our own athletic uniforms, and were not allowed to compete on varsity teams. But it was also about people, about my teammates, how basketball saved us from insecurities, from my house where my parents were really descending into Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's in their 50s. Incredible, two parents, coincidentally both having Alzheimer's. I didn't tell people that. I didn't talk about it. When they showed up at halftime because my dad drove my mom to Iowa instead of my basketball games, that wasn't something I shared with anyone. Becky, the freshman on the team, she didn't tell us that she was in an abusive household, that her father went to the school board and begged for her to go to Niles West. She was supposed to go to Niles East because Niles West had a girls' basketball team and he had to get her out of the house, and he knew that she would love basketball. I didn't know about my best friend, Peggy. I knew that her mother was a single mom. I knew that she worked 2 jobs. I didn't know that their father, that they had a restraining order, that he was mentally ill, that he was stalking the family. I did know that it gave us a place to find ourselves in that gym, and it brought me back to that gym 40 years later. This was when the Today Show a couple years ago did a feature on us, which was incredible. Got me back to my high school teammates there posing with that same picture with the trophy. Made me realize one thing, though. I wish I would have written stuff down. I was grateful for our memories and for all the newspaper clippings I was able to find, and the scrapbooks we kept, and even cassette tapes we had. But I didn't have what you could have right now if you write it down. Just jot it down. It made me realize when I got together with them and started writing that the story wasn't about the state championship at all. It was about people, where every good story begins. The best writers, again, are the curious. They're the best observers. Look around you guys. Stories are everywhere. And the best writers don't concern themselves with flowery prose, but simply getting out of the way of a good story. So write that first chapter. Read like crazy. There are important stories everywhere. There are beautiful stories. There are stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Anyone can be a writer. I never thought I would write 1 book, let alone 3. So I'd love to answer your questions. We have a little time left. Thank you so much for having me. I've got other stories to tell, but I'll let you guys ask questions and see if I stumble on some of them. But
And I have the microphone, everybody, so if you want me to come to you, I can, or if you just want to shout it out, we can do that too, okay?
Yeah. Well, it's funny you should ask that because, I mean, there's obviously no, real answer to that. I think most really great authors, New York Times bestselling authors, there's a guy, Jeff Pearlman. Has anyone ever heard of him? He wrote Showtime that became, he wrote a lot of books. He wrote books about Walter Payton. He's written about 11 books, many of them, most of them bestsellers. He takes 2 years. He interviews maybe 500 people. That's not even an exaggeration. I've written books in as little as 3 months. I wrote the book on Lou Piniella in August. I was approached to write it by the end of the baseball season. Baseball season ends at the end of September. I was going to the Olympics the next week. I was going to China, to Beijing. And I was like, I can't do this. But I did. And I just started. I just started interviewing people. I ended up interviewing 100 people. I was in tears most of the time because I thought I'd never do it. And one time a friend just said, just sit down, start writing. Even if you haven't done all your reporting, just start writing. And that's what I did. So I did that maybe 3 months. And I probably did the original manuscript for the state in maybe 4 or 5 months. And I rewrote it and rewrote it and rewrote it over the years as it changed. The book about the Bulls was probably 5 months, 6 months. And I did it while I was working as a reporter at the Tribune, which is hard to do, but it was really fun. And it gave me an opportunity to write things I never would have been able to covering the team. So, yeah, sorry, that was a long answer, and there's no real good answer to that. Anyone else? Yep. Oh, that's not a good start at all. Okay, you try. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's not going to offend me, certainly, unless I work at Fox News, which I didn't, thank God. Yeah, I mean, I make no bones about it, sorry. I reveal myself for that little comment. But, I alluded to it earlier that when you see photos, we reasonable people trust that when we see reports, when we see stories, when we see photographs, that we believe that it's true, that we believe that journalism starts with the truth. Good journalism starts with the truth. The fact that, what was the last story that Fox News weighed in on that was really kind of scary? Well, they do it every day, but I'm trying to think of, maybe it was the Will Smith story that, whatever it is. I mean, you have to choose. We're in a time where everybody's in their own silos. You know that. You listen to what you want to listen to. You get the Instagram posts that you want to get. You look at the TikToks that you want. We don't often listen or read stuff we don't want to hear, we don't like, or we don't agree with. So if you like Fox, watch Fox, but do it with a skeptical eye. Do that with everything you watch. But yeah, that's me. That's, I guess without flat out saying that I don't watch Fox. I mean, I guess I just said it. Yeah, I don't trust that. It's tough though, because nowadays also opinion is so meshed with news that we don't know when it's opinion and we don't know when it's news. I'm teaching 2 sports writing classes this quarter, one for grad students, one for undergrads, and I don't let them write opinion. There are other classes for that. And they kind of look at me like, how do we do that? How do you write sports without an opinion? And my answers are like, every schmo on a bar stool can write an opinion. Write facts and let people come to their own conclusions, right? I don't have to tell you that the Bulls played terribly the other night, All I have to do is give you the facts of what happened, and you could come to that conclusion yourself. So I think too many journalists kind of try to hit us over the head with their opinions when really all they have to do is some responsible reporting. So that's my long, winding answer. Yeah. Oh, I saw someone back there, but then you. Yeah, I'll be faster, sorry.
How did you get your job at ESPN?
It was really easy. I got laid off from the Tribune. It's funny because I teach journalism and I was laid off twice. And it was, it speaks to where journalism was in 2008 or 2009. Try to blank it out. After a 20-year career from the Tribune, that week I had won a pretty major writing award. I was laid off. And the only solace was that I was laid off with some amazing people. So luckily, ESPN had an ESPN Chicago at the time, and so they sort of took me in, and I wrote for them until they laid me off with a bunch of other really good people in 2017, and then I kind of went, well, maybe somebody's trying to tell me something. I've been teaching all those years, and I thought, well, I'll go back to that. But I have friends who still say to me, how can you teach journalism when you sort of experienced the underside of it? What do you tell your students? To run for the hills, to not to do this? And I always say, there will always be a place for great storytellers. And my students, all of our students at Northwestern, a very high percentage of them get jobs. They get great jobs. They just don't follow the same traditional path, maybe, but some of them do too. So I don't even remember what your question is because I'm meandering so much. I'll get to you, but yeah.
Based on how impressive your resume is, all the things you covered, what was your favorite event that you've experienced?
Wow, that's really tough. I loved covering tennis. I covered the Australian Open and Wimbledon and the US Open. But standing on the court for the first Bulls championship that I covered as the principal beat writer for the Tribune, and the first World Championship in Chicago since, I don't remember, but well beyond our lifetimes, when the Bulls won in Chicago their second championship, witnessing that and being able to capture that and write that front page story and just be there and stand in the middle of that chaos when the Bulls went down to their locker room and I followed them, and listening to Phil Jackson address them and get them in a huddle and all of them crying, and then coming back on the court and Michael grabbing them and saying they want us back up on the court and jumping on the scorer's table and doing a dance on the scorer's table and pulling his teammates up. I mean, talk about gold, all I did was kind of just stand there with my computer and just write stream of consciousness. That's getting out of the way of a good story. I didn't have to write that. That wrote itself.
How did you get your first job?
My first job as a journalist was at a paper called Florida Today in Cocoa, Florida. And I was a Chicago girl, I was like you guys. I grew up here. Well, maybe some of you didn't grow up here, but I grew up here in Lincolnwood. I didn't want to leave home. I was the youngest of four. I was very kind of babyish, to be honest. And, but, even then, there weren't journalism jobs. You couldn't go to the Tribune out of college. Very, very, very few. And you don't want to go to the Tribune out of college if you're me. There's too many mistakes I had to make first. But I ended up living in Cape Canaveral and covering, Cape Canaveral, where all the moonshots were, and sadly watching the Challenger explode when I was at that paper. But yeah, that was my first job, Florida Today. It was a Gannett paper, and it was a terrible, in a really bad neighborhood, very dangerous neighborhood. And they walked me across the street to this little motel, and the guy stood on the other end of the door, on the other side of the door, and he goes, okay, I want you to close the door. And I closed it. He goes, can you hear me? I'm like, yeah. He goes, I want you to get a chair. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, and I want you to jam it under the door handle. I'm like, what? He's like, yeah, it might not lock good, and it's not a good neighborhood. I want you to jam it under there. So that was sort of a little bit discouraging, but I did end up taking that job, and it was phenomenal. And it led me USA Today, and then which was also a Gannett paper. Yeah. The worst experience I had There was a guy named LaTroy Hawkins on the Cubs who was really mean. Albert Bell was really, really mean. I had one experience that turned out to be cool. This is an interesting story. I was a Bears fan, of course, growing up. I was a huge Bears fan. And then I went to work at Florida Today that I told you about. And I ended up covering the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and I was in Tampa, and they were covering the Bears, and I was so excited. And I was going to make sure that I got into the Bears locker room to get those quotes. And, you know, you can't be a fan, but, you know, deep inside I still was. And so I went in their locker room, and it was, 1983 maybe. And the players were really mean to me. They hadn't seen that many women in the locker room. So they were just very snide and sort of bullying me. And I was trying to be tough, but I was, it was tough. It was hard. And these are my heroes. And all of a sudden I feel a hand on my shoulder, and it's Walter Payton. And he puts his arm around me, and he was one to really embarrass people. Whether he liked you or didn't like you, he could really embarrass you. And he walked me around the locker room and kind of introduced me to people. And then I left. I was happy that I just even got to meet him. And as I walked out, he took me again. He goes, come on, come here. You didn't get all your interviews. I go, no, you're right. I did not. He leads me onto the team bus, and he stands there kind of with his arms crossed while I talk to players. And he implicitly was sort of demanding that they speak to me. So whatever I ever heard about Walter Payton, and years later, he will always be really special to me because of that. So that was a cool story. That was one that ended up well. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Sorry I could get you. Thank you, guys.